It started with a ping in the dead silence of my hotel suite. 2:14 a.m. The hour of bad decisions and worse regrets. My phone lit up on the nightstand, casting a harsh blue ghost against the wall. I expected a crisis update from legal or a panic attack from the CFO. Instead, I saw a name that made my pulse spike for all the wrong reasons. Alice Miller. It wasn't a red line document. It wasn't a threat. It was a draft, clearly never meant for my eyes, sent to opposing counsel by the slip of a tired finger. We were 48 hours away from the biggest healthcare merger of the decade, a deal worth billions, and the woman trying to destroy me had just accidentally handed me the keys to her psyche. The screen glowed in the dark, and as I unlocked it, everything I thought I knew about my enemy shifted on its axis. To understand the weight of that error, you have to understand the room we had been locked in for 3 months. Corporate healthcare mergers aren't business. They are blood sport, played in rooms that smell of ozone, dry cleaning, and fear. The conference rooms were always freezing, kept at a temperature designed to keep minds sharp and empathy low. We lived under the hum of fluorescent lights that bleached the color out of everything, leaving only gray suits and black ink. I thrived there. I don't deal in care. I deal in precision. Companies hire me when they need to carve out the rot, streamline the organs, and stitch the patient back together before the market opens. I am the scalpel. I don't get emotional about the tissue I remove. I was hired to come in, assess the damage, and make the cuts that the internal board was too weak to make. I was the bad guy, and I wore the label comfortably. It gave me distance. It allowed me to look at a hospital system and see a flow chart instead of patients. And then there was Alice. Alice Miller was the CEO of the Target acquisition, a woman who wore bespoke suits like armor and treated every negotiation session like a surgical procedure, where I was the tumor. She was sharp angles and terrifying competence. Her reputation was built on a foundation of absolute, unflinching control. In the boardroom, she didn't just sit, she occupied space, with a gravitational pull that bent the light around her. She had a way of looking at you, cool, assessing, utterly devoid of warmth, that made you check your own structural integrity. Most CEOs I dismantled were bluster and ego, terrified of losing their kingdoms. Alice didn't defend her kingdom, she fortified it. She knew the numbers better than my analysts. She knew the legal precedents better than my counsel. She was a woman who had clearly decided a long time ago that emotions were a liability she couldn't afford. Our interactions had been a cold war, fought with spreadsheets and silence. She disputed my valuations with a calmness that was more insulting than shouting. She dismantled my integration strategies with 3 words and a raised eyebrow. It became a game. A dangerous, high-stakes game of chess, where the pieces were hospitals and the board was the city. I would push for a 15% reduction in administrative staff. She would counter with a restructuring plan that saved the jobs but cut the overhead, staring me down while she did it. "Your math is lazy," she told me once, sliding a dossier across the table. "You're cutting muscle, not fat." I remember feeling the heat rise in my neck, not from embarrassment, but from the thrill of it. Finally, someone who could parry. Finally, someone who made me work for it. We developed a language of micro-expressions. A tightened jaw meant she was annoyed. A tap of the pen meant she was bored. A slight narrowing of the eyes meant I had scored a hit. In a room full of 20 people, lawyers, bankers, consultants, the only real conversation was happening between us. It was intense, exhausting, and strangely addictive. We locked eyes constantly, a silent battle for dominance that had nothing to do with equity and everything to do with who would blink first. The air between us in those meetings was so thick with tension, you could taste the metal. It wasn't sexual, at least I didn't think it was. It was the friction of 2 tectonic plates grinding against each other, waiting for the earthquake. I respected her. I hated her. But mostly, I was fascinated by the sheer, impenetrable surface of her. She seemed to exist without friction. No loose threads, no hesitation, no humanity to get in the way of the deal. I watched her drink black coffee without wincing. I watched her fire a VP without a change in her heart rate. I assumed she went home to a house made of glass and slept in a bed made of steel. She was the perfect adversary, a mirror of my own ruthless efficiency, just on the other side of the table. I thought she was made of steel, impenetrable and cold, until I read the words she never meant to send. I sat up, the hotel linens pooling around my waist, and tapped the notification. I expected a misfire, a blank message, a pocket dial, or perhaps a cryptic link to a file I couldn't access. What I found was a wall of text, unformatted and dense, stripped of the bullet points and bold headers Alice used like weapons. It was sent from her personal address, likely drafted on a phone in a moment of insomnia, and fired off to the wrong contact in her directory. The subject line was simply, "Notes on the collapse." The text wasn't a strategy document. It was a raw, unfiltered hemorrhage of anxiety. It read like a distress flare, fired from the bottom of the ocean. "I don't know how to keep the ceiling from coming down," she had written. "The air in these rooms is getting too thin. I look at them across the table, the board, the lawyers, her, and I wonder if they can see the structural fatigue, or if I've polished the surface so hard it's just blinding them. I am so tired of being the smartest person in the room. I am so tired of the performance. I want to be the person who gets to rest. I want someone else to drive the car for 5 minutes. Just 5 minutes, where I don't have to calculate the velocity of the crash. I feel like I'm starving to death at a banquet. If I have to wear that suit one more day, I think I might shatter." I read it twice, then a third time. My thumb hovered over the glass, trembling slightly. The silence of the hotel suite, usually a comfort, suddenly felt oppressive. I could hear the hum of the mini fridge and the distant wail of a siren 30 floors down, but my focus was entirely pinned to the blue light in my hand. This wasn't data. This was a confession. It was a bleeding slice of her internal monologue, served up on a digital platter. The sensory details of the moment are branded into my memory. The cold condensation on the glass of water on my nightstand, the rough texture of the carpet under my bare feet as I swung my legs out of bed. The feeling of vulnerability radiating from the screen was so potent it felt physical, like heat coming off a radiator. I felt like a voyeur. I felt like I had walked into her executive suite and found her naked, or weeping, or both. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Alice Miller wasn't a robot. She wasn't the ice queen I had constructed in my head to make the dismantling easier. She was a woman holding her breath. She was trapped in the very role I was trying to buy out, starving for something real in a world of projections and quarterly earnings. The unflinching stare she leveled at me across the boardroom table wasn't arrogance. It was a desperate attempt to keep the mask from slipping. Standard protocol was clear. You delete it. You pretend it never arrived. Or, if you are the shark they pay you to be, you forward it to the partners. You use it as proof of instability. You weaponize her exhaustion to lower the acquisition price. Look, I could say, the CEO is cracking. The leadership is compromised. I knew that play. I had written that play a dozen times, but I didn't forward it. And I didn't delete it. Instead, I felt a pull, a strange, illicit gravity that tugged at the center of my chest. I sat there in the dark, the phone growing warm in my hand, feeling a sudden, terrifying intimacy with the woman I was supposed to be destroying. I held her secret. I was the keeper of her vulnerability. The professional distance that had protected me for months didn't just erode, it evaporated. I wasn't looking at a target anymore. I was looking at a mirror. The friction between us, which I had dismissed as competitive hatred, suddenly felt like something else entirely. It was recognition. I finally set the phone down, face down on the nightstand, as if that would contain the radiation. I didn't sleep. I watched the sun come up over the city skyline, painting the steel and glass canyons in shades of bruised purple and gray. I thought about her lying in her own bed, perhaps realizing what she had done, or perhaps sleeping the deep, chemically induced sleep of the high-functioning burnt out. When I showered and dressed, buttoning my own suit, the fabric felt heavier than usual. When I walked into the boardroom 4 hours later, the air felt different. It was no longer sterile. It was charged with the static of what I knew. The dynamic had shifted permanently. I wasn't just her rival anymore. I was her witness. And as I opened the heavy oak doors, I knew the merger was the least dangerous thing that was going to happen in that room today. The next morning, the boardroom felt like a pressurized cabin. The air was recycled, cool, and carried the faint metallic scent of ozone from the copiers and the bitter aroma of stale coffee. Usually, these sensory details faded into the background of my focus, white noise against the signal of the deal. Today, everything felt amplified. The hum of the projector fan sounded like a jet engine. The scratch of a pen on legal pad paper sounded like a nail dragging across a chalkboard. I sat in my usual seat, the leather cool against my back, and waited for the performance to begin. Alice entered at 8 a.m. sharp. She didn't walk. She executed an arrival. The doors swung open, and she stepped through with the kind of kinetic energy that usually accompanies a storm front. She was wearing a charcoal suit today, tailored to within an inch of its life, the fabric absorbing the harsh fluorescent light rather than reflecting it. Her hair was pulled back into a knot so severe it looked painful, pulling her features tight, highlighting the sharp architecture of her cheekbones. To the 12 other people in the room, the legal counsel, the financial analysts, the nervous VPs, she looked like a titan of industry, a woman made of Teflon and ambition. But I had the blueprint now. I looked at her, and I didn't see the CEO. I saw the woman who wrote that she was starving to death at a banquet. I saw the hairline fractures in the porcelain. When she sat down opposite me, placing her tablet on the mahogany table with a deliberate, controlled movement, I saw the slight tremor in her index finger before she locked her hands together. It was a micro movement, a glitch in the programming, invisible to everyone who hadn't read her soul at 2 a.m. "Let's begin," she said. Her voice was steady, low, and stripped of any unnecessary inflection. It was the voice of the machine. "We have 3 days to finalize the integration strategy for the clinical teams. I want to see the redundancy reports." My lead analyst, a young man named Kevin who was terrified of Alice, started walking through the slide deck. He talked about operational synergies and headcount reduction. I wasn't listening to the numbers. I was watching Alice listen. She was staring at the screen, her face a mask of polite interest, but her eyes were glazed, focused on a middle distance that didn't exist in this room. She was holding her breath. I could see the shallow rise and fall of the silk blouse at her collarbone. She was enduring this meeting, not leading it. "The attrition rate is projected at 12%, Kevin said, his voice wavering. "That's optimistic," I said, cutting in. My voice sounded louder than I intended. I wasn't looking at Kevin. I was looking directly at Alice. Systems under pressure don't always break cleanly. Sometimes they just erode from the inside until the whole ceiling comes down. Alice's head snapped toward me. It was the first time she had looked me in the eye since entering the room. The contact was immediate and physical, a sudden jolt of current. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with the faint shadows of insomnia that concealer couldn't quite hide. She narrowed them slightly, assessing the threat. She heard the echo of her own words in mine, the ceiling coming down. "We build supports to prevent collapse," Alice replied, her tone icy. "That's what the transition team is for, to shore up the weak points." "Supports are heavy," I countered, leaning forward, resting my forearms on the table. I dropped my voice, making the room feel smaller, more intimate. And if the foundation is already tired, adding more weight doesn't save the building. It just accelerates the crash. Sometimes you have to admit the structure is failing. The lawyers shifted in their seats. They thought we were arguing about hospital administration. They thought I was questioning her company's solvency. They didn't understand that we were having an entirely different conversation, in a frequency only 2 people could hear. "My foundation is solid," Alice said. The words were clipped, precise. "We are discussing personnel, not architecture." "Are we?" I asked. I let the silence stretch. I wanted to see if she would flinch. I wanted to see if the woman who wrote the email would peek out from behind the CEO. Because looking at the data, it seems like leadership is carrying a load that isn't sustainable. You can only polish the surface for so long before people realize it's just a reflection. She went still. Absolutely still. The pen she was holding hovered over her notebook. For a second, the mask slipped. I saw a flash of raw, terrified exhaustion in her eyes. A plea, or perhaps a warning. It was the look of someone who had been found out. She knew. She realized in that second that I had seen the email, that I hadn't deleted it, and that I was currently dissecting her with her own vulnerability. "We move to the next slide," she said. But her voice lacked its usual steel. It was brittle. The meeting dragged on for another hour, but the dynamic had shattered. Every time she spoke, I watched her throat work. Every time she corrected a figure, I saw the effort it cost her. I wasn't trying to destroy the deal anymore. I was testing the tension on a wire, waiting to see when it would snap. When the meeting finally adjourned, the room cleared quickly, people eager to escape the heavy, static-charged atmosphere. I packed my things slowly. Alice remained seated, staring at her tablet, but the screen was black. She wasn't working. She was waiting. The proximity between us wasn't just physical distance. It was a magnetic field, unavoidable and dangerous. The transition to the hallway was a blur of polite nods to people I didn't care about. I was tracking Alice. She moved toward the elevator bank with that same purposeful stride, but I noticed she took the far car, the one reserved for executives. I slipped in just as the doors were gliding shut. The other suits stayed back. They knew better than to interrupt a strategy session. The doors clicked. The silence descended instantly. It was a glass elevator, one of those architectural vanities that allowed you to watch the city shrink beneath your feet. Usually, I liked the view. Today, the only thing I saw was the reflection of the woman standing 3 feet away. We were suspended in a transparent box, rising through the atrium. The mechanism hummed, a low vibration traveling up through the floor. Alice didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead at the steel doors, her jaw set. But I could feel her awareness. It radiated off her like heat from pavement. The air in the car felt thick, pressurized. "You're hovering," she said, her voice flat. She didn't turn her head. "I'm observing," I corrected. I took a step closer. There's a difference. I could smell her perfume now. It wasn't floral. It was something cool and sharp, like linen and rain. It was a scent designed to keep people alert, not to draw them in. But in this proximity, it was intoxicating. I watched the pulse point in her neck. It was beating too fast. "You were reckless today," I said softly. She finally turned. The movement was sharp. I was managing a hostile entity. That requires aggression. "I'm not talking about the meeting," I said. I took another step. We were inches apart now. I could see the fine grain of powder on her skin, the slight unevenness of her eyeliner where her hand must have shaken that morning. I'm talking about 2:14 a.m. Her pupils dilated. It was involuntary, a biological betrayal of the panic she was suppressing. She held my gaze, her eyes dark and defiant. "It was a mistake," she said. Her voice dropped an octave. It wasn't the CEO voice anymore. "Delete it." I didn't delete it, I admitted. I read it, twice. The tension in the small space spiked. The elevator seemed to slow down, the floors ticking by with agonizing slowness. I reached out, not to touch her, but to rest my hand on the railing behind her, effectively boxing her in. She didn't retreat. She leaned back slightly, her shoulder brushing against my arm. The contact was electric. It sent a shockwave through my chest. "You're playing a dangerous game," she whispered. She looked at my mouth, then back up to my eyes. It was a challenge. "You're the one who sent me the map to your breakdown," I countered. I leaned in, lowering my voice until it was just a breath against her ear. "You said you wanted someone else to drive. You said you were starving." She flinched then, a tiny, imperceptible shudder. I moved my hand from the rail and let it hover over the emergency stop button. The red circle glared at us. If I pressed it, we would be stuck here, suspended between the lobby and the boardroom, with nothing but the truth between us. "Do you want me to stop it?" I asked. "Do you want 5 minutes?" Alice looked at the button, then at me. For a second, I thought she would say yes. I saw the hunger in her face, the desperate need to just stop the relentless forward motion of her life. She looked at me not as a rival, but as an escape hatch. "Don't," she breathed. But she didn't move my hand from the panel. We stood there, suspended in the glass cage, the city sprawling below us, Two enemies who had suddenly become conspirators. The air was heavy, sultry with the things we weren't saying. I wanted to kiss the exhaustion off her face. I wanted to tear that perfect suit apart and find the woman who wrote the email. Then the bell chimed. A cheerful, synthetic sound that shattered the moment. The elevator slowed to a smooth halt. My hand dropped from the button. Alice straightened her jacket, the mask slamming back into place instantly. "Floor 40, she announced, stepping around me. "Don't be late for the valuation review." She walked out without looking back. But as the doors closed behind her, leaving me alone in the glass box, I could still feel the warmth of her body where we had almost touched. The heat lingered, a ghost in the machine. By 3 o'clock, the conference room had turned into a slaughterhouse of billable hours. The initial politeness of the morning had evaporated, replaced by the jagged, ugly reality of asset valuation. My legal team was currently trying to dismantle Alice's intellectual property portfolio, arguing that her company's flagship diagnostic software was built on deprecated code. It was a brutal, technical assault designed to drive the acquisition price down by $40 million. Usually, I would be leading this charge. I would be the one finding the cracks in the masonry and hammering the chisel in until the structure gave way. But today, I was useless. I sat at the head of the table, a spreadsheet open in front of me, the numbers swimming in a sea of gray cells. I couldn't focus on the depreciation schedules. Every time I tried to calculate a risk coefficient, my mind flashed back to the elevator. I could still feel the phantom warmth of her shoulder against my arm. I could still hear the drop in her voice when she asked me not to press the button. The professional partition I had built my entire career on, the firewall between the job and the human, had been breached, and now the data was corrupted. I found myself watching her instead of the screen. I watched the way she defended her company. She was magnificent in a corner. When my lead counsel, a shark named Peterson, tried to interrupt her, she cut him off with a voice like a whip crack. "If you interrupt me again," she said, her voice low and dangerous, "I will pull the exclusivity agreement and shop this deal to your competitors by 5 o'clock. Peterson shut his mouth. I should have stepped in. I should have backed my dog. But I just watched her, fascinated by the flash of fire in her eyes. It was intoxicating. The sheer competence of her, the way she wielded her authority like a blade, made my breath catch. I wasn't thinking about the merger. I was thinking about the email. I am so tired of the performance. I realized that this terrifying display of dominance, was exactly that, a performance. And God, she was good at it. But then I saw it. Alice was dismantling Peterson's argument about the software patents, citing case law from memory. She was winning the room, but her left hand, hidden partly by the edge of the table, was betraying her. Her index finger was tracing the edge of her tablet, over and over again. A frantic, rhythmic motion. Up, across, down. Up, across, down. It was a nervous tic, a physical leak of the anxiety she was bottling up. It matched the description in the email perfectly. The feeling of the walls closing in, the desperate need for a release valve. And then she slipped. "The Q3 valuation was audited by Deloitte," she said, her voice steady. "The figures stand at $12 million. The room went silent. My team froze. Peterson's eyes lit up. She had said Q3. The audit she was referencing was from Q2. Q3 hadn't been finalized yet, and the preliminary numbers were significantly lower due to a market correction. It was a fatal error. If she was presenting Q2 numbers as Q3, it was technically fraud, or at the very least, gross incompetence. It was the kill shot we had been waiting for. Peterson opened his mouth, ready to tear her throat out. He was going to humiliate her, destroy her credibility, and tank the price. I looked at Alice. She hadn't realized the mistake yet. She was still holding her chin high, defiant. But the finger on the tablet had stopped moving. She was frozen, waiting for the blow. I had a choice. I could let the shark eat. I could win the deal right now, on my terms, and walk away with a massive bonus and a broken rival. That was the job. That was the precision I was paid for. "She means the projected Q3 based on the Q2 audit," I said. My voice cut through the silence, loud and authoritative. I looked directly at Peterson, my eyes hard. "The adjusted run rate supports the $12 million figure. Move on. Peterson looked at me like I had grown a second head. But the dates. I said move on, I snapped. We aren't here to argue semantics. The valuation holds. I looked back at Alice. The color had drained slightly from her face. She knew. She realized exactly what she had said, and she realized that I had just thrown my body in front of the bullet. I had lied for her. I had undermined my own team to protect her structural integrity. She stared at me, her eyes wide, the unflinching mask completely gone for a split second. There was no triumph in her expression, only a stunned, naked confusion. Why? Why would the enemy save the stronghold? I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I just looked down at my spreadsheet, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had just compromised the deal. I had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Fine, Peterson muttered, shuffling his papers, clearly furious. We'll table the IP valuation. The meeting ground to a halt shortly after. The momentum was gone. My team was confused and angry. Her team was relieved but suspicious. We ended the day in a stalemate, the deal neither dead nor alive, simply suspended in the heavy, charged air between us. We need to settle the final terms, Alice said, as everyone packed up. She wasn't looking at her team. She was looking at me. Privately. The lawyers are just making noise. Agreed, I said, my voice tight. The bar downstairs, she said. 7 o'clock. It wasn't a request. It was an appointment to discuss the terms of my surrender, or perhaps the terms of our complicity. As I walked out, I knew I wasn't an architect of precision anymore. I was an arsonist, and I had just handed her the match. The hotel bar was a study in shadow and velvet, designed for illicit affairs. It smelled of old money, dark mahogany, expensive leather, and the faint, bitter scent of orange peel. The amber lighting flattered tired faces and swallowed sound before it could travel to the next booth. I found Alice in the furthest corner, a sharp silhouette against the heavy drapes. She wasn't looking at a screen. She was tracing the rim of a heavy crystal tumbler with that same finger, the one that had betrayed her anxiety in the boardroom. I slid into the booth opposite her. The leather creaked, a sound that felt too loud in the intimate quiet. She didn't look up immediately, letting the silence stretch like the air before a storm. You drink bourbon, she stated, sliding a second glass across the polished wood toward me. It was already poured. Neat. I drink whatever numbs the headache you give me, I replied, wrapping my hand around the glass. The cold weight of it was grounding. Why did you do it? She finally looked up. The lighting here softened the sharp architectural angles of her face, stripping away the office hardness. Her eyes were liquid in the dim light, dark and searching. Peterson had the kill shot. You stepped in front of the gun. Maybe I don't like blood on the carpet, I said, taking a sip. The burn was welcome. Or maybe I realized that winning on a technicality isn't winning. It's just luck. You don't believe in luck, she countered. You believe in precision. And today, you were sloppy. Deliberately. She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, invading the neutral zone between us. You saw the crack and plastered over it. Why? Because of the email, I said. The air between us froze. The background hum of the bar dropped away. I didn't just read it, Alice, I continued, my voice a rough whisper. I felt it. Starving at a banquet. That's not a business strategy. That's a cry for help. She recoiled slightly, as if I had touched her physically. But she didn't leave. It was a moment of weakness. It was 2 a.m. It was the most honest thing you've produced in 3 months, I said. I reached out and tapped the rim of her glass. You wear that suit like it's a fortress. You speak in bullet points. You act like you're made of steel. But I see the chaos underneath. And frankly, the mess is a hell of a lot more interesting than the CEO. Alice stared at me. Her lips parted slightly. A flush rose on her neck, visible even in the dim light. You think you see me, she murmured. But you're projecting. You're looking for a flaw because it makes you feel safer. If I'm broken, then you don't have to be afraid of me. I'm not afraid of you, I lied. I'm afraid of what happens when we stop fighting. She laughed then, a low, throaty sound that vibrated in my chest. It wasn't a corporate laugh. It was dark and genuine. We're not fighting anymore. We haven't been fighting since you walked into that elevator. She picked up her glass, the ice clinking softly. She took a long swallow, and I tracked the movement with a hunger that had nothing to do with the merger. Shadows played along the curve of her jaw. "You have a lot of control," she said, setting the glass down. Her voice was huskier, stripped of the boardroom polish. "You walk into a room and you arrange the furniture with your eyes. You calibrate the temperature. But I wonder..." She trailed off, her gaze dropping to my mouth before snapping back up to my eyes. "I wonder what it takes to make you lose it, to make the architect drop the blueprint." "Careful," I warned, though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "That sounds like a challenge." "It is," she whispered. "Because you're right. I am starving. And you're the only person in this entire city who actually knows what I'm hungry for." The confession hung there, suspended in the amber light. She wasn't talking about food. She wasn't talking about the deal. She was admitting that beneath the armor, she was desperate to be seen by someone who understood the cost of the crown. "That's dangerous talk for a negotiation," I said, my voice unsteady. "We aren't negotiating," Alice said. She signaled for the check with a sharp flick of her hand, but her eyes never left mine. "We're done talking." We left the bar in silence, moving through the lobby like satellites in decaying orbit. But as we stepped out onto the street, the city had conspired against us. The sky had opened up, a torrential downpour turning the pavement into a mirror. The valet stand was swamped. We were stranded under the awning, the cold, damp air forcing us closer together until the sleeve of my jacket brushed against hers. The heat of her arms seeped through the layers of wool and silk, burning me. The night wasn't over. It was just moving to a smaller room. "My driver is 10 minutes out," Alice said, staring at her phone as the rain hammered the awning above us. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, sticking it to her lip. It was the first time I had ever seen her look unkempt. It was a tiny detail, but it felt momentous. "Mine is here," I said, nodding toward the black sedan idling at the curb, its hazard lights pulsing in the gloom. "Get in. I'm going past your building anyway." It was a lie. I lived in the opposite direction. But the logic of the storm overrode the logic of the map. Alice hesitated for a fraction of a second, calculating the risk, assessing the liability of sharing a confined space with me, before nodding. She didn't argue. She was too tired to argue. We dove into the back seat, escaping the deluge. The door thudded shut, sealing us inside a hermetic capsule of dry, warm air and expensive leather. The sudden silence was jarring. The noise of the city, the sirens, the thunder, the shouting valet, was instantly cut off, replaced by the rhythmic thwack hiss of the windshield wipers and the low hum of the climate control. The interior was dark, lit only by the passing streetlights that sliced through the tinted windows in rhythmic intervals. Flash, darkness. Flash, darkness. In those strobe light moments, I saw her profile. She had slumped back against the seat, her head resting against the headrest, eyes closed. The formidable CEO was gone. In her place was a woman who looked like she had been carrying the weight of the sky on her shoulders for a decade. The car was spacious, but not spacious enough. As the driver merged into the chaotic traffic, the car swerved slightly, and gravity did the rest. We slid together. My thigh pressed against hers. The contact was startlingly intimate. Through the damp wool of our coats, I could feel the solid warmth of her leg. In a boardroom, she would have pulled away instantly, reestablishing the demilitarized zone. Here, in the dark, she didn't move. She stayed pressed against me, a silent admission that she didn't have the energy to fight the physics of the turn. The air in the car thickened, heavy with the scent of wet pavement and that cool, sharp perfume she wore. It was suffocating and intoxicating all at once. I looked at the back of the driver's head, a silent, anonymous witness to the dismantling of a rivalry. "You can't keep doing this," I said softly. I didn't look at her. I looked at her hands, which were resting loosely in her lap, fingers curled inward. "Doing what?" Her voice was a murmur, barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof. "Holding up the walls with your bare hands." The email wasn't just venting, Alice. It was a structural report. "You're fracturing." She turned her head slowly on the leather, opening her eyes to look at me. In the shadows, her gaze wasn't sharp. It was unguarded. "And what would you have me do? Let it collapse? There are 4,000 employees depending on the stability of this merger. I don't get the luxury of falling apart. You don't have to fall apart, I said. But you don't have to be made of stone either. You sent that email to me. Subconsciously maybe, but you sent it. You wanted someone to see the cracks. I wanted to scream, she corrected. You just happened to be the one standing in the echo chamber. I'm not just standing there, I said. I shifted, turning my body toward her. The leather groaned beneath us. I'm the one who knows how to shore up the foundation. I'm not trying to destroy you, Alice. I haven't been trying to destroy you for weeks. She looked at me, searching my face in the intermittent light. The defiance that usually defined her features had softened into something that looked dangerously like hope. You're the enemy, she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. They were a habit, not a truth. I'm the only person who speaks your language, I countered. I reached out. It was a breach of every protocol we had established, a violation of the neutral ground. I placed my hand on her knee. The contact was electric, a sudden spike of voltage that made my breath hitch. I felt her muscles tense beneath the fabric, a reflex, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she exhaled, a long, shaky breath that seemed to empty her lungs of months of tension. You shouldn't have seen that email, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It gave you too much leverage. I'm glad I did, I replied. My thumb brushed against the fabric of her trousers, a slow, deliberate caress. Because before that, I thought you were just a suit. Now I know you're the storm inside it. She moved then. Not away, but toward me. She turned her body, her knee pressing harder against my hand, closing the remaining distance. She lifted her hand, and for a terrifying second, I thought she was going to push me away. Instead, her fingers brushed the hair back from my temple, her touch cool and hesitant. You're reckless, she murmured, her eyes dropping to my lips. I'm precise, I whispered. I moved my hand from her knee, tracing the line of her jaw, feeling the pulse hammering in her throat. I know exactly what I'm doing. The car slowed, the momentum shifting as we pulled up to the curb of her building. The red taillights of the car in front of us flooded the cabin with a crimson glow. The driver put the car in park, the locks clicking open with a sound of finality. But neither of us moved. My hand was still on her face. Her hand was still caught in my hair. The rain blurred the world outside, turning the sidewalk into an abstract painting of gray and neon. We were suspended on the precipice of a decision that would ruin the merger and save us both. We're here, she said, but she made no move to open the door. I know, I said. The air between us was so charged it felt flammable. The question is, are you getting out or am I coming in? The next morning, the world was white. Not the soft, diffusing white of a cloud, but the harsh, strobe light white of 100 camera flashes going off in unison. The signing ceremony was held in the Grand Ballroom, a cavernous space draped in banners celebrating synergy and future horizons. It felt less like a business transaction and more like a state wedding, complete with the forced smiles and the undercurrent of panic that accompanies any permanent binding of assets. I stood to the left of the podium, watching Alice navigate the press pool. She was back in the armor today, a navy suit so sharp it could cut glass, her hair reinstated in its severe knot. To the reporters from the Journal and the Times, she looked exactly like the Titan they expected. Cold, untouchable, a woman who ate market shares for breakfast. They asked her about stock valuations and redundancy packages. They asked her about the regulatory hurdles. They treated her like a machine that had successfully processed an algorithm. But I was standing at the right angle to see the glitch. I saw the way her hand tightened on the lectern when a reporter asked about leadership stability. I saw the way her eyes flickered toward me, just for a fraction of a second, seeking an anchor in the storm of flashbulbs. It was a microscopic crack in the facade, visible only to someone who had spent the previous night dismantling the wall brick by brick. We hadn't just survived the storm, we had navigated the wreckage together, and the secret knowledge of her vulnerability sat in my chest like a second heart. When it was time to sign, the room went quiet. The silence was heavy, ritualistic. We sat side by side at the long table, the merger agreement spread out between us like a treaty. It was 300 pages of legal density that boiled down to a simple surrender of autonomy. Usually, this is the moment of triumph, This is the kill. I had spent my entire career chasing this specific high. The moment the other side capitulates, and I win. But as I picked up the heavy fountain pen, the weight of it felt different. I looked at Alice. She was already looking at me. We weren't looking at the documents. We were having an entirely different conversation in the space between us. A dialogue conducted in the frequency of silence. "Are you sure?" her eyes asked, dark and steady. "I'm not leaving," my gaze answered. I realized then that the definition of winning had shifted overnight. It wasn't about domination anymore. It wasn't about standing over a defeated opponent and counting the spoils. It was about finding the one person in the room who understood the crushing weight of the ceiling. I didn't want to break her. I wanted to stand next to her and hold the structure up. The rivalry hadn't been about hatred. It had been a rigorous interview process. We were testing each other's load-bearing capacity, seeing if the other could survive the pressure. We signed. The scratch of the nibs on the archive paper was loud in the quiet room. Alice Miller, narrator. The names sat next to each other, bound in ink. It was a legal merger of corporations, yes, but the subtext was a merger of vulnerabilities. We were signing a contract that said we would no longer have to hide the chaos alone. As the applause broke out, a polite, thundering wave of clapping from the bankers who were about to get very rich, we stood up to shake hands. It was the photo op the press had been waiting for. The two most powerful women in healthcare, uniting forces. Alice took my hand. Her grip was firm, professional, perfect for the cameras. But then she squeezed. A quick, hard pressure that had nothing to do with the photo. It was a signal, a pulse. I leaned in, ostensibly to whisper a congratulatory remark for the cameras, bringing my lips close to her ear. The smell of her perfume, that cool rain and ozone scent, filled my head, grounding me instantly. "Smile," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the applause. The foundation held. I pulled back. Alice didn't smile. She wouldn't give them that. But the corner of her mouth twitched, a private tremor of amusement that belonged only to me. The ink dried, the cameras flashed, and the room cleared, leaving us standing in the wreckage of the deal, knowing that the real work was just beginning. The champagne went flat faster than I expected. The bubbles had vanished, leaving a sugary, pale residue in the crystal flutes. That's the unspoken truth about victory laps. They are exhausting. An hour later, the ballroom was empty, save for the cleaning crew sweeping up the confetti that looked disturbingly like shredded documents. We retreated to the executive suite on the 42nd floor, the one that was now technically ours. The silence here was different than before. It wasn't the pressurized silence of a standoff. It was the heavy, settling silence of the aftermath. The adrenaline of the signing was fading, draining out of the room like water from a tub, leaving behind the jagged, undeniable reality of what we had just done. We had merged two massive entities, billions of dollars in assets. But the real integration was happening right here, in the quiet space between the heavy oak door and the floor-to-ceiling window. Alice kicked off her heels. It was a small act of rebellion that felt monumental, a shedding of the costume. She walked to the wet bar and poured 2 sparkling waters, the celebration whiskey seemingly forgotten on the shelf. She handed me the glass, her fingers brushing mine, lingering on the cold condensation, grounding us in the physical moment. "So," she said, leaning against the mahogany desk, looking at me with a terrifying clarity. "The glitch." "The email," I corrected, taking a sip. The bubbles bit my tongue. "It wasn't a draft," she admitted softly. The confession hung in the air, heavier than the 300-page merger agreement we had just executed. I didn't misclick. I didn't confuse you with my therapist or my lawyer. I saw your name in the directory at 2:14 a.m., and for a split second, my thumb just decided. "You wanted me to know," I said. It wasn't a question. It was the closing argument. "I wanted to see if you would use it," she replied, her eyes tracking the movement of the city lights outside. "I wanted to know if the shark would bite, if I bled in the water. It was a test, I think. Or maybe just a surrender. I was so tired of holding the ceiling up alone, and you were the only one looking up." I stepped closer. The professional distance was gone, replaced by a gravity that pulled us inevitably together. "You aren't alone anymore. But we can't build this out there," I said, gesturing to the door where the world of shareholders and analysts waited. Out there, you're the CEO and I'm the operator. We have to be sharp. We have to be the armor. And in here, she asked, her voice dropping to a hush, the vulnerability radiating off her like heat. In here, we can be the mess, I said. We build a hidden room, a space inside the architecture where the structural integrity doesn't matter, where you can crack and I don't have to fix it. I just have to hold you until the shaking stops. She looked at me, and the relief on her face was devastating. The unflinching Alice Miller, the woman who terrified board members and ate competitors for sport, looked at me with a vulnerability that was entirely open. She reached out, her hand finding the lapel of my jacket, smoothing the fabric with a possessive, deliberate slowness, pulling me in not for a kiss, but just to be close. We stood there, foreheads touching, breathing in the same recycled air, the tension of the last 3 months finally resolving into a stable chord. A hidden room, she repeated, testing the weight of the words against her tongue. No spreadsheets, no valuations, no performance. Just us, I promised. And the silence. We moved to the window, looking out at the city we now effectively controlled. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick, black, and reflecting the neon glow of the skyline. It looked chaotic down there. Traffic, noise, millions of people running in different directions. But up here, behind the glass, it was quiet. We stood shoulder to shoulder, two architects of a new reality. The merger was complete on paper. The press releases were sent. The stock was already climbing. But looking at our reflection in the darkened glass, two women standing close enough to share a heartbeat, I knew the real work was actually just beginning. We had built the fortress. Now we had to live in it, without letting the walls close in. Precision is a lie we tell ourselves to feel safe. We build grids to keep the chaos at bay, but sometimes the mistake is the most honest thing in the room. I used to think victory was about control. Now, feeling the weight of Alice's gaze across our shared office, I know better. Victory is finding someone who isn't afraid of the wreckage. If you've ever found intimacy in the friction of a rivalry, subscribe for more stories.